As a church, we're taking part in a project called Growing Young. We've been telling you a bit about it over the first few months of the year. It's a process. It's based on research that's been done into churches that are doing a good job with all generations, especially younger generations, and looking at some of the key ingredients to those kinds of churches. It's a process we want to get involved in to help us work better with younger generations. And to help us do that, one of the key things that we've planned to do over the next months actually, is to listen. It's to listen to each other. Good leadership, we're told, begins with listening. Good ideas are all very well. Great plans are all very well. Shiny projects are all very well. But what we want is to, at heart, help, serve, be useful, be a blessing to real people. And that involves listening. Listening hard to each other. And that's not new for this West Church community. We've been a group of people who have constantly come back and said, what is God doing and how can we join in? One of the gut instincts that some of us often have when thinking or doing stuff about younger people is that we assume that there is an older, experienced generation that has all the resources, the answers, the wisdom, and that then what we need to do is to just pass that on to younger people. But the reality is that every generation has its own gifts and talents. And that the wisdom that we need is often something that we discover together with each other. It's not just by one group owning it and selling it to another. I've discovered that as I get to wrestle with the stories in this collection of books that we call the Bible, a book that reveals a story about a God and his interactions with his people, that so often in here, younger people seem to get it, often far more than the more experienced, senior people who probably should. In a book called Luke, the writer has begun his story with two nice older people called Zechariah and Elizabeth. They end up having a baby despite being well past childbearing age. And this all happens in the centre of the Jewish story, in the temple in a city called Jerusalem. But this writer, Luke, then drags the story way up north to a place called Galilee, a place barely mentioned. An area called Nazareth. As another Luke Skywalker might say, if there's a bright centre to the universe, then this is the place that's furthest from it. It's the back end of nowhere. And even worse than that, this area is too close, far too close to places like Samaria, unclean places for Jews that they can't stand, people they don't trust. If Luke was making his story up, the last place he would choose for it to be set at this point is Nazareth in Galilee. And in fact, the last person he would involve is a young girl. But a messenger, that's what the word angel means, appears to a young girl called Mary. Well, that's the translation we get. But in actual fact, in her own language, she'd have been called Miriam, like more or less 50% of the young women of her time. We're told she's betrothed, which is a legal arrangement. Betrothed to be married to a man called Joseph. If this was a typical first century marriage, then Mary would be a teenager, an early teenager, and Joseph a good maybe 10 years older. This marriage would have been arranged by their parents. What Luke does note is, though, that Joseph is a descendant of someone called David. Why? or right at the start of his story. A story that's going to be about the life and the death and the resurrection of a man called Jesus of Nazareth. Luke carefully ties his story into a much bigger story, the story of the Jewish people and actually the story of humanity and God right from the beginning of creation. And Luke wants his listeners to know that this child is going to be descended from David. David was their greatest king. This story is a story about a God of promises. And some of those central promises are to King David and about King David. But back to this teenage girl and this angel. Sometimes translations smooth things over about her reaction, but the language makes it clear that Mary is actually terrified. And like all the angels in all these stories, the first thing the angel has to do is reassure her, don't be afraid. But then he announces that Mary is going to give birth to a son, and she is to name him Jesus. Again, here we're getting the Greek translation. The name he would have been given is Yeshua, or Joshua. It's connected to Hosea. It's connected to the word Hosanna, which means God save us. And also, like Mary, it was one of the most common names of the time. An ordinary teenager, ordinary names, an ordinary nothing village in the far from anywhere place in the north. This messenger goes on. This Jesus won't be ordinary. He will be called Son of the Most High. Now, a phrase like that would be familiar to Luke's listeners. People in the first century trying to live out this movement based on this Jewish teacher, Jesus of Nazareth, in the face of the Roman Empire, are listening out for stories of hope. And that phrase would be familiar because it's the kind of thing they heard often in their Jewish stories of hope. It's the kind of language used about their greatest king, David. This angel says that this child will grow up to have the throne of David. And even more than that, he says he will have a kingdom that will never end. Luke's story, we've already seen, is a promise story. He talks about things being fulfilled. And Luke is carefully setting his story in a bigger story, which is also the story of a God who makes promises, a God who makes commitments and then keeps them. And one of those first promises was to a man called Abraham, that the Jewish people would become a special nation, a people that would partner with God, that would be part of putting things back together, a kingdom of blessing to all nations. But that wasn't how things were working out for this teenage girl and her people. The Israelites are currently under yet another empire. They're little more than slaves, not special, not putting anything back together. So what happened to God's promises? The Jewish songs, stories, prophets and poets all agreed that they were in this mess because, well, not because God didn't keep his promises, but because they, Israel, had not been faithful to their God. They'd not been faithful to who they were made to be. Instead, they'd chased after other empires, other ways, other gods, fake gods, and destructive ways of trying to live things out. So much for keeping their promises. What seems to get Luke excited for me is that this God, he believes, has actually always been at work. And that there is actually a real new hope. And that's why he believes their God has kept, over the years, inspiring their prophets, their artists, their musicians with messages about how things will turn around. And many of those centered around this idea of a son of David, somebody who would be part of God's kingdom being put back together. And the famous line of those promises that there would become a son of David who would be a real son of David, who would be a real king, a leader like David, who'd establish this kingdom forever. But that forever kingdom isn't just a familiar phrase because of their songs of hope. There was another set of leaders who used that phrase time and time again to stamp their authority on the first century. These were the emperors of Rome. They'd taken their own power to the limit and declared themselves gods. And they promised a kingdom of peace without end, imperium sine fine, a forever kingdom. So when Luke tells a story of an angel who mentions a forever kingdom, this is a controversial challenge to the empires of the day. They promised all sorts of things, but none of it was like God's plan. None of what they promised actually seemed like putting things back together or bringing a blessing. Mary might just be an ordinary teenager from the back end of nowhere, but it's not so ordinary to have a baby like this. Mary asks the technical question of the angel. How will this be? It's not that she's doubtful, she's just curious. This is not normally possible without a couple having sex. The angel's answer is suitably vague, but at the same time, what Luke is getting across is that something special is happening here. That means this child will be both fully human, but fully God. It's not an accident the way God uses so many phrases in language here that are used all the way through the Jewish story of their own God. This is their God getting involved in a surprising new way. And then Luke carefully weaves back into his story that nice old couple, Zechariah and Elizabeth. Remember, they were too old for a child, but look what happened. Well, what's happening with Mary is even more impossible, but as the angel says, nothing is impossible, or nothing will be impossible with God. And by using that phrase, Luke draws his listeners right back to the start of their stories with another old couple called Abraham and Sarah, who were too old to have a child, but as their God said to them, is anything too hard for the Lord? And that tribe, that nation, that family of Jewish people began with that big promise. Luke's story, the story of the Bible, the story of God, is a story of promises. A God who makes promises and who keeps those promises. And sometimes, in fact more than sometimes, this God works in ways that are way beyond human expectation and invites the most surprising, upside down kind of people to be involved. Some people may have discounted those nice old couples as yesterday's people. What do they have to offer? What could God be doing through them? Some people may have discounted a teenage girl from the back end of nowhere. What does she know? What could she have to offer? What could possibly do through someone like her? This God invites the most unlikely people to join in, to be part of what he is doing. That's what he's actually made them for. Luke wants us to see and hear how these ordinary people respond to God's invitation. And then he wants us to respond. Mary responded with these words, I am the Lord's servant. May your word be fulfilled. That's that word again, fulfilled. What kind of things get fulfilled? Promises are fulfilled in the most surprising ways. This was Mary's response. The most unlikely person. What is God doing here? And how can I join in? I want us to listen. What is our God doing here? And how can we join in?